Rust is often found on old uh, computers, especially ones with metal housing or other metal parts that are over time exposed to the elements. A particularly vulnerable spot is kind of everything that's um, in the way of air, because dust settles in these places and it can attract moisture and then lead to that moisture causing the metal it's attached to via the dust to start to rust and corrode over time. This piece here, which is the back plate of a power supply for an IBM 5170, looked very different, and I'll try and find a picture and show it to you, but this had rust everywhere. In this case, it wasn't because of the fan that was sucking in air, but because the battery that was sitting right next to it had essentially exploded and was leaking all over the metal, and the corrosive liquid corroded the metal. You wouldn't notice, but you can see here some indentations on the metal where it's been eaten away, and here I've already cleaned this up as much as possible and tried to restore it to its former glory. But what I wanted to do is talk about some methods that I use commonly to try and treat rust, get rid of it. Now, before you complain, this is definitely not what is going to get the job done. So forget about Windex for a change, as much as we love it to clean our beloved vintage computers. But this calls for more robust methods. And depending on what the root cause of the corrosion is, you might have to start in different ways. If, like such in this case, the battery has exploded and the battery liquid is a base, then the best way to do that, get rid of that, is to use regular household vinegar. And I like these little nail varnish bottles with the built-in brush, because you can easily get into small spots and apply it. But I also use like empty spray bottles that can easily be somewhat easily be refilled with vinegar to spray it on, and sometimes you have to do it several times. Spray it on, wait for the acid to neutralize the battery base, because if you don't do that, it will continue to eat away at the metal, even if you scrape it off. It's possible. Once you've done that, and sometimes you hear and see it fizz due to a reaction of the acid and the base of the battery liquid, you simply wash it off with a lot of water. If you have components such as the power plugs that are bolted onto the metal and you can't get rid of them, but they may have been exposed to the vinegar, it's worth soaking this in clean water, maybe overnight, but you want to make sure that you get all of the vinegar out of every single nook and cranny. Otherwise, the vinegar will continue what the battery liquid started. Eat away at your metal, slowly but surely. And then give it a good dry. You can use compressed air to get rid of it, or simply continue to use isopropyl alcohol. This here I have in a spraying bottle, or you soak it. That will simply accelerate the drying process. It gets rid of the water, it evaporates more quickly. But make sure that you get it dry very thoroughly and very quickly, to make sure you don't have any trapped water anywhere. Once that is done, the rust may still be there. So you can do various things. What I usually like to do is I start either with a metal brush, or there's also one that has brass which is a little bit softer and gentler on the metal. Or I use a Dremel with wire brushes, and I have different types I wanted to briefly show you, and looks like they've already been used, but depending on where you need to go, if you have any kind of tricky corners to operate in or smaller holes, like this one is a very fine tipped one that can get into screw holes, you can use those to gently get the rust off the metal, but please be careful. Do wear protective glasses, because these things will spill those tiny little metal wires all over the place, and if you're unlucky, into your eyes, and you definitely don't want that to happen. So please wear safety goggles, safety glasses if you use this. Another way to remove some of the corrosion, and this is also useful on PCBs, is this little glass fiber pen. This is usually used for automotive purposes to scratch like tiny little amounts of the paint off around chips to kind of fix those, but also good for small amounts of surface corrosion, especially on PCBs. You will find that once you've removed it, the metal can look quite ugly. It'll leave dark marks where the rest of the metal might be silver, but that's okay. Now, another thing that I sometimes like to use is evaporust. So what this does is it transforms the rust, it stops it. I have no idea what the actual chemical reaction behind this thing is, but it seems to work fairly well. It's reusable, so you can put this in a glass or another container, dunk your metal into it, and then put it back in the bottle after a few hours and reuse it a few times. It also claims to be biodegradable and non-toxic, so that's always a plus. I sometimes use this in addition to scraping off the rust, depending on how much there is. Now, all of these methods, as I mentioned, might leave some dark marks on the metal, which, depending on how exposed it is, you may want to get rid of. And so what I've done to this piece here, because it did look very different, I simply used a little bit of kind of metallic silverish spray paint to cover it up evenly to make it look pretty again. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is that, of course, covering the metal with spray paint can cause your grounding to not work properly anymore. So if you have spots like at the power supply case here where grounding wires need to be attached, you do want to make sure that the wires can still make contact with the metal of the case, and likewise anywhere where that case is connecting to other metal parts. So theoretically all you do is you take some metal implement like a little screwdriver or a spatula and scrape off the paint just enough for it to make contact with whatever wire or other things are going to make contact with the case. Now, what can happen sometimes on a PCB, in this case, this is the motherboard of a 286 IBM AT, the corrosion from, let's say, a battery leakage can get into components such as the ISO slots, and in this case it did. When I took this apart, I noticed some green gunk at the edges of this slot here, and I believe the one next to it. So what you can do here is, to get in here, take a blunt kind of syringe, fill it with vinegar, and then get it droplets in here. It won't necessarily harm this if you don't leave it in for weeks at a time, but do that a couple of times, and what I usually do is I'll prop it up at an angle so it doesn't flow into this direction onto the other components of the motherboard, but downwards onto either a towel or in a sink. And then once that has done its job of getting rid of the corrosion, you can just rinse it with water and then blow it out with compressed air, just let it dry. Best to use the ionized water so it doesn't leave any other residue, or even better, put it into an ultrasonic bath, I believe is what that's called. Use contact cleaner, whatever tricks you can think of to get rid of the water as quickly as possible and let it dry out. And that should ideally help get this back into shape. Now, things such as the evaporest might help with this as well. Whatever you do, try to remove any kind of removable components as much as possible. So I did take off this lovely 286 CPU, goes back into the socket here once I'm done restoring this. But again, if you don't leave the vinegar in here for too long, there's typically not much damage that you can do other than getting the leaked battery liquid neutralized, assuming it's a base. Now, believe it or not, rust can also get onto plastic surfaces. I don't know if you can see it. I tried to remove most of it, but inside of the power switch cover, there used to be a lot of rust here at the bottom. I don't know if there's some left that you can see still. A little bit back here still. But believe it or not, rust on plastic is harder to remove than from the actual metal. I've tried various methods. Obviously, I tried various types of brushes, vinegar, the evaporest solution, bartender's friend, which is like Ajax, a mild abrasive. You could also just use baking soda. There's still plenty left in here, trust me. But since this is plastic, I won't be concerned with it too much. It's mostly for optical purposes to prettify the plastics. So on the outside, I've made sure to get rid of it by vigorous treatment with bartender's friend, I believe it's called. And on the inside as much as possible, but since this will not be visible, this should be fine as is. I'll leave links to some of those products in the description below. If you're interested, you can check them out, get them from wherever you like. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section as well. But I hope this was useful. Thank you for watching.